On a March morning in Rome, the most powerful man in the world walked into a hall full of his closest friends. He had conquered nations, won a civil war, and made the proudest city on earth bow to him alone. Within minutes, those same friends had drawn their daggers and struck him down, again and again and again. He had spared their lives, raised them to honor, and called many of them by name as they killed him. By the time he fell, 23 wounds had been driven into the master of Rome by the men he trusted most. This is the story of the losing side. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, born into an old but fading noble family of Rome. Rome in his day was not ruled by a king, but by a proud republic of senators and elected men. For centuries, the Romans had hated the very idea of a king and killed any man who reached for a crown. But the republic was rotting from within, torn apart by ambitious generals and rivers of borrowed gold. Caesar was clever, charming, and fearlessly ambitious, and he climbed the ladder of office one rung at a time. He spent borrowed fortunes to win the love of the mob, until he was buried in staggering debt. To rise above his rivals, he joined hands with the two most powerful men in Rome. One was Crassus, the richest man in the world. The other was Pompey, Rome's greatest living general. Together these three carved up the republic between them in a secret bargain for power. But Caesar wanted more than gold or office. He wanted glory that no rival could ever match. So he took command of the armies of Gaul, the vast wild lands that are now France and beyond. For 8 long years he marched and fought across 100 tribes and rivers and forests. He won battle after battle, and the plunder of Gaul made him fabulously rich and loved by his soldiers. By the end, 1 million people were dead, and 1 million more were sold into slavery to feed his glory. His legions came to worship him, for he shared their hardships and led them to victory after victory. Now Caesar commanded the most experienced and devoted army in the entire Roman world. But while he conquered abroad, his alliance at home was falling apart. Crassus marched east in search of his own glory and was destroyed, and his head became a trophy. With Crassus dead, only 2 giants were left, and Rome was not large enough for both of them. Pompey, jealous and afraid, threw in his lot with the old senators who hated Caesar's growing power. They commanded Caesar to give up his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. He knew that the moment he was alone and unarmed, his enemies would destroy him in the courts. So Caesar gathered his men on the bank of a small river called the Rubicon, the border of Italy itself. To cross it under arms was treason, an act of open war against his own homeland. He paused there for a long moment, and then he spoke the words, "The die is cast," and he led his legions across the river and plunged the Roman world into civil war. All Italy trembled as Caesar marched south, and Pompey fled the city without a fight. Pompey crossed the sea to gather a vast army from the eastern provinces of Rome. For months the two old allies hunted each other across the Mediterranean world. At last they met on a plain in Greece called Pharsalus, where Pompey's army was far the larger. But Caesar's veterans were harder, hungrier, and surer, and they broke Pompey's grand host to pieces. Pompey fled the field a ruined man and sailed to Egypt to beg for shelter. There, as he stepped onto the shore, the Egyptians murdered him and cut off his head to win Caesar's favor. If you enjoy these stories of mighty men brought low, take 1 second to subscribe. Now, back to the streets of Rome. When Caesar reached Egypt and was handed the head of his old rival, even he is said to have wept. He lingered there with the young Queen Cleopatra, then crushed the last of his enemies in 3 more wars. He returned to Rome not as one man among equals, but as its undisputed master, where other conquerors would have butchered their foes. Caesar chose a stranger weapon, mercy. He pardoned the senators who had fought against him, and even raised them back to wealth and office. Among those he forgave were 2 men named Cassius and Brutus, whom he treated almost as sons. He reformed the calendar, relieved debts, and filled the Senate with his own loyal men. The people adored him, and statues of Caesar rose in temples beside the gods themselves. He was granted power after power, until at last he was made dictator not for a year, but for life. No Roman had ever held such authority, and to many it looked terribly like a crown. For 500 years Rome had murdered any man who tried to make himself a king. Now one man held the army, the treasury, the senate, and the worship of the crowd in his single hand. At a public festival, his friend Mark Antony 3 times offered him a royal diadem before the people. Caesar pushed it away, but the watching senators saw a man being fitted for a crown. Whispers spread that he meant to make himself king in all but name and rule Rome as a dynasty. To the old families, this was the death of everything the Republic had ever stood for. A group of senators began to meet in secret, calling themselves the Liberators. At their heart were the very men Caesar had pardoned, Cassius the bitter and Brutus the beloved. Brutus was descended from the hero who had cast out Rome's last king centuries before. His friends played on that pride, telling him that only he could free Rome from a tyrant once again. They fixed upon a day for the deed, a meeting of the Senate on the 15th of March. In those final days, men said the omens turned dark and strange across the city. A soothsayer is remembered for a single warning to Caesar: beware the Ides of March. On the night before, his wife Calpurnia dreamed of his murder and begged him not to go. Caesar himself, worn and unwell, almost stayed home and called off the meeting of the Senate. But one of the conspirators came to his house and gently shamed him into coming after all. And so, against every warning, Caesar set out for the Senate on the morning of the Ides. The Senate was meeting that day in a great hall attached to the theater of Pompey. His dead rival? As Caesar passed through the streets, he is said to have met the soothsayer and mocked his warning. The man answered quietly that the Ides of March had come, but had not yet gone. Inside the hall, the conspirators crowded around him under the show of begging a favor. One of them seized Caesar's robe and pulled it down from his shoulders as the signal. Then the first dagger struck, and Caesar cried out and tried to fight his way free. But the daggers came from every side at once, more than 60 men closing in for the kill. It is said that when he saw Brutus among them, blade in hand, he covered his face and stopped struggling. Pierced by 23 wounds, the master of Rome fell dead at the foot of Pompey's statue. The killers rushed out into the streets, holding up their bloody blades and crying that Rome was free. But the people did not cheer them. They stared in silence, and then in rising fury. At the funeral, Mark Antony showed the crowd Caesar's torn and bloodied robe and read out his will. Caesar had left his gardens to the people, and a gift of silver to every citizen of Rome. The grief of the mob turned to rage, and they hunted the killers through the burning streets. The Liberators had struck down one man, but they had not saved the republic they dreamed of. Instead, they had lit a new civil war that would tear the Roman world apart for 13 more years. Cassius and Brutus were hunted down and destroyed, and most of the conspirators died violent deaths. Out of the chaos rose Caesar's own heir, a cold young man named Octavian. He would defeat every rival, take the name Augustus, and become the first emperor of Rome. The republic that the killers had murdered Caesar to save was gone, and it never returned. The man they feared as a king had become, in death, something far greater, a god and a name for emperors. For from that day on, the rulers of Rome would carry his name, Caesar, for 2,000 years. He had won everything a man could win, and lost it all in a single morning to the friends he had spared. This has been the story of the losing side.